In today's video, I'm going to show you some easy but powerful tricks you can use to get creative macro shots just like these. I've been out exploring the amazing River Almond walkway, looking for some macro shots. And I have already found a few bits and bobs that I like, but in particular I found some of the snowdrops which has just started to bloom. And I've been snapping away with my 35mm macro lens here, but there are a few tricks that I'm going to use to try and take what might be otherwise fairly mundane snaps into something a little bit more interesting. And the great thing is, it doesn't involve spending a lot of money. So let's get started. Don't be afraid to get your camera right down on the ground, because it really helps you get more interesting angles when you're shooting things like flowers or other plants. Also why I love shooting with a 35mm macro, because we get such an amazing wide angle view here, really capturing those flowers close up to the camera, but still giving all of the context of the grass around it, and of course all of that out of focus background behind them. I'm shooting wide open at f1.8 here because I really want to maximize that shallow depth of field. I'm auto focusing on the larger of the snowdrops. It's a little bit closer to the camera. Fortunately, it's really windy today, so every so often a big gust comes along and they move all over the place. So I'm just trying to time it right, so I'm taking my shots when they're really still. But one little trick I'm going to try is doing a double exposure. I want to take a photo vertical this way with the snowdrops on the bottom of the frame. Then I'm going to flip the camera over and try and get like a mirror image of them together. It's going to look a little bit weird, but it's just something a little bit more creative that you can try. So I'm starting off focusing again on the snowdrop, but I'm putting it right in the bottom third of the frame. Take my shot. And then we see an overlay on the camera screen of the double exposure. So I flip the camera over, get my focus. You know what, maybe it's not that great a shot. Other thing I'm going to try is using a prism in front of the lens. This is a technique that you've probably seen on like Instagram or TikTok of people doing portraits, using a prism to get sort of weird light flares and effects in your scene, but it can be a really way of getting some creative light coming in to a macro scene, particularly in a shot like this, because as I'm shooting at the snowdrops, it's actually got a lot of kind of sunlight coming in from behind the scene, therefore kind of coming in, and that's going to allow me to sort of spin the prism round and hopefully create some interesting effects. It's quite easy to do because you get your scene set up like I have now, and then you basically sort of hold this prism in front of the lens. And as you kind of slightly move it in and out, or you turn it, you get these sort of weird light flares that give you a sort of rainbow effect. And so the more you move it around, the more interesting that effect becomes. Sometimes it becomes a little bit too extreme. So it's about kind of being a bit subtle with it, creating these slight sort of ghosty mirror images. And again, these like rainbow flares that come in. Very sort of dreamy and ethereal. And these are great because you can just pick these up very cheaply on Amazon, and they're very small, so you can just sort of keep them in a pocket in your kit bag, bring it out when you need to. So I'm just going to start shooting away, finding some interesting ways to hold this prism. But another trick that I want to try here is something that I believe is called freelancing. It basically involves shooting with your lens slightly detached from the camera. What that does is create different like focus effects. It lets light leak into your camera body from behind the lens. It basically creates all these artifacts that your expensive camera and lens should not give you, basically making it look like a cheap toy camera. But it can create some really interesting effects, and I found it can work really well in macro. So what I'm going to do is basically unscrew my lens, not quite take it off though. I'm just going to sort of slightly pull it out of its housing. Of course, this relies on live view, and I'm going to have to start moving in and out from the scene to get that focus. because the focus now relies on how far you move the lens away from your body and how close you are to your subject. So as I sort of move the lens away from the body, our subject becomes less in focus, but then as I bring it closer, then we start to get it back in focus again. But then we start to get all these light leaks coming into the camera sensor. And so it does allow you to get some really interesting looking effects. Manual settings here, and I'm shooting away, and I'm just trying different angles. I'm even trying slightly twisting the lens. Taking a lens off like this can make it very hit and miss in terms of the shots that you get, so I have found that it's best to fire away quite quickly, take lots of shots, because the focus is very difficult to get and the composition is more difficult to get because that lens is actually moving around. So rather than just taking 3 or 4 shots and considering it done, I definitely recommend maybe putting your camera on burst mode, firing away, taking shot after shot. Hopefully then, at least one of them is going to look quite good. And it goes without saying that given that you're exposing your camera's image sensor to the elements, don't do it if it's raining or if it's dusty. I really like this free lens technique. I'm quite pleased with some of the shots I've got on the back of camera. The great thing is that it costs nothing. It's just taking off slightly the lens you already have. And your camera might complain about taking photos when the lens isn't attached. And on many cameras, there is a setting in the menus that allows the shutter to be released when there isn't a lens attached. I think it is easier with mirrorless cameras, so you might need to do a little bit of digging depending on the model you've got. I've really enjoyed trying these little tricks. It's definitely been fun. I've definitely found that it's given me a little creative burst. So I'm going to take those over into Lightroom and see how I can make them look even better. So I've brought the images over into Lightroom and straight away I'm going to address the double exposure because I'm very conflicted about this shot. What I've actually achieved here, I don't like basically at all. It's dull, it's boring, it doesn't really kind of take advantage of what you can achieve using double exposure techniques. And I've done a couple of others, and this one is just a big mess of nothing, and this one is, it just doesn't really do anything. So I'm kind of disappointed with that, but I do think that it's a really, really powerful technique, and it's one that I think has potential, certainly in macro. And so I'm going to spend some time playing around with this a little bit more. I want to try it with different subjects. I want to try replicating the same subject like I've done here, creating mirror images, but I also want to try maybe using a double exposure where I take one photo with, let's say, a snowdrop, and then actually put that against a completely different background and see whether anything more interesting can be created that way. The great thing is that with digital photography, you can create these in camera and you can do as many as you want and it doesn't cost you anything. So even though I don't think I'm giving very good examples of double exposures here, I definitely recommend giving it a go and seeing if you can create something even better than I've done, which really is not a very high bar to hit. But the Prism shot and the Freelensing, I do like the results from. So I'm going to take you through some of those. I'm going to start with this one here. This one, perhaps obviously, is done using the Prism. We've got this lovely lens flare here. We've also got a little bit of reflection caused by the glass. So as a result, it's created this very sort of light and dreamy atmosphere where the actual subject, this snowdrop here, I think really stands out nicely from everything else going on. There's a few things I want to do just to try and liven it up a little bit more. I'm just going to start off with the temperature. I'm going to bring that down a little bit, just cooling it off. And I'm going to bring the tint ever so slightly down as well. Something like this. I'm going to play with my shadows, maybe bring the shadows down because I really like this being quite a minimal shot with just kind of the highlights hitting the snowdrop itself. And I'm going to then go down to our HSL. I'm going to start off in the hues and I'm going to get those greens, and right now they're a little bit sort of yellowy, so I'm just going to increase that until they go slightly more of an emerald green. They do look oversaturated as a result of doing this, so I'm going to counter that just by bringing that green saturation back down just to make it look a little bit more natural. Now in the luminance, I'm going to grab the yellows, and if I just pump that up and down, you can see that it's really emphasizing those highlights just on the top of the flower here and on some of the blades of grass. So I'm going to whack that all the way up, pretty much. 82 I think looks fine. And I'm just going to have a look at the greens as well. And I want to do that a little bit, but if we look particularly up here, that's a little bit too far in. It quickly goes a little bit overexposed on the actual green of the snowdrop. So there's somewhere around plus 15-ish, I think looks really nice. If we just look at our before and our after, very minimal change, but I think already looks quite like a bit of a nicer shot, I think. Let's bring in a crop. I'm going to go 4x5. Rather than it being tall and thin, it's a little bit more central on the flower itself. And I'm just going to adjust it just to something like this. I really like that we've got these lovely reflections going on here. And I'm actually going to try and emphasize those using a brush tool. I'm going to bring in quite a large brush. I'm going to increase the whites, slightly the highlights, and also a little bit the clarity. And I'm just going to paint this in around this side, just like this. And right now it's a little bit subtle, so I'm going to go a bit harder with those whites. And as I do, if I just sort of move that up and down, you can see how much it's really emphasizing these like light flares coming in here. I really like the look of that. So I'm going to put that quite far up and maybe upping that clarity even more. Clarity is an interesting tool. It's often overused, but it's often overused when you just use it across your entire image, when you'll see images on Instagram where someone's just gone plus 100 clarity and everything looks very weird and crunchy. But I love using it. It's a very, very powerful tool, but only when you very selectively paint it into certain areas. And I think this is a really good example when we are increasing that clarity and that punch. And it's really emphasizing the flares here and also these lovely reflections, but it's not causing any harm to the rest of the image. So now if we look at our before and after, we can see not only have we brought the colors into a much nicer balance, but we've also really emphasized those light effects that we've created using the Prism. So I'm quite pleased with how that looks, and it's one of those things where it's easy now because of what I've done for me to copy those settings, maybe go over to another one like this one here, and I can just apply those settings. Yeah, I don't like this shot quite as much, but I think you kind of get the idea of what we can achieve. I did some work on some of these other ones. This one I don't quite like as much. We've got a lot of flare going on, but it sort of is what it is. This one again, very dark, but I do like the sort of rainbow flare going on in the top of the frame. And then these ones I've done using the freelensing technique. So I've done a couple of edits of some of these. It's quite, the actual effect from the freelensing is quite subtle in some of these. This one, it's more powerful because we've got this sort of blue haze to the image, and that's come from light getting behind the lens and directly hitting the image sensor. And I do really like that. I don't love that it's a blue haze. I've slightly warmed this image up, which I think does help it a little bit. But we can see that again on this shot here, and also a little bit less in this one. But we have still got some of that effect. We've also got a lot more shallow depth of field because I've been holding the lens slightly away from the camera. If we just look at our details, my image is probably actually covering this panel, but I can see that it says 1/1600th of a second, but there's no aperture information because there was no lens attached. And actually one thing I didn't mention in the video is that without the lens being attached, in order to set your aperture, you need to have it attached to the camera, then set your aperture, in this case f1.8, and then remove the lens from the camera. But here I would probably do similar things that I did to the previous one. So let's just paste those settings straight away. So we've already got that lovely cool effect. We've got that quite underexposed look coming in here. But what I like about this is that we've got this nice patch of highlight in the background here. And I'm going to bring in a radial gradient over the top of this, feathering it out quite a lot because I just want to kind of emphasize that a little bit more. Bringing it up, reducing the highlights, but bringing up the exposure and the whites so that it's casting a bit more of a light through the snowdrop in the foreground. So we just turn that off and on, off and on, off and on, you can see that it is hitting that flower a little bit more. And it looked realistic because that light is there in the background. If I tried putting this gradient in on one of these dark areas, it would look very, very weird. So it's not about creating light from nothing. It's about emphasizing what already is there. But I'm going to bring in a crop tool. I'm not going to go 4x5, but I am just going to bring it in here so that the top of the flower kind of falls in line with our rule of thirds, and then as do these ones on this kind of central square. And to be honest, I think that is all I would do with this. It is not the most exciting of photos. It is not an award-worthy macro image, but I do think that trying these techniques, the freelensing technique and the Prism one in particular, has allowed me to get some shots that I wouldn't have got just by using my standard camera and lens. So these are techniques that I'm certainly going to play around with a little bit more because they're so easy to do. The only extra bit of equipment I need to take with me is that little Prism, which I just bought for cheap off Amazon, and I'll leave a link to one in the description. But doing the freelensing also lets you get some powerful effects, and again, it costs nothing because you just take the lens off that you've already got. But that brings me to an end of today's video. I really hope that you've enjoyed seeing these and that maybe even you've got some inspiration for trying some of these techniques yourself. If you do try them, then please definitely share the results with me on Battery HQ on Instagram. I'd really love to see what you can achieve using these same techniques, particularly with the double exposures, because I think lots of you out there are incredibly creative photographers. I'm sure that you will be able to take some really, really good ones. But if you have enjoyed this video, do please hit that like button and certainly consider subscribing to the channel if you don't already. And I will see you next time.